This is Kareem from Open Source Defense, and I am here with Jay Idris from Pew Science. Welcome.
Hello. It's good to meet you.
Good to see you too,
meet
Jay.
you formally now, I guess.
I know. We've talked a bunch, but now it's official. We're on a podcast together.
That's right. It's not real until it's on a podcast, I guess.
Exactly. All right. So low back pressure silencers. Overhyped or underhyped?
Interesting. Gosh, that's it's funny that you ask. I literally, like I was telling you before we started the recording, we started a few minutes late, and so I was getting some work done. And I'm actually working on some analysis for an article or a couple articles that are coming out in a couple weeks, and there'll be a couple more coming a couple weeks after that. And it just so happens it's at least 4 silencers that are quote unquote low back pressure. And just by that, in our workload here at Pew Science, you can see that it's obviously non-trivial that they're occurring, like they exist. So whether or not that's a hype or a fad, I'm not sure. But what I do know is that there's a reason why they're being pursued.
Yeah. Well, it seems like a few years ago, even in your writing and analysis, it seemed like the trade-offs were much more kind of front and center. Like, okay, this is low back pressure, but you're giving up XYZ on suppression. Yeah. And it seems like those trade-offs have just gotten less and less and less to the point where, is it just like the end of history? Are they just better now? And everything's going to be low back pressure?
I think, I guess well, for one, I agree with you. For two, I was thinking about that as you were saying it, and I haven't really thought about it in that way, but you're 100% right that when they first came on the scene, it was OSS doing them, right? That was like the main. There were others too, but OSS was the primary manufacturer pushing this quote unquote low back pressure technology, and they have their own trademark for their specific technology they use, but they were the ones really pursuing it. And in the infancy, it was very rudimentary. Well, I don't want to say rudimentary. It was complicated physically, but the ideas were more rudimentary, and it showed in the performance. I mean, the compromise was huge. Like you had, in order to get any semblance of efficiency, you had to use extremely high pressure, and putting subsonic rounds through a low back pressure silencer was a recipe for a super loud silencer. It just wasn't working, and that's actually not too far off. Still, we're still having really low efficiency in the subsonic ammunition combustion regime from low back pressure silencers, but they're increasing in efficiency. And the more, I think with anything, the more a technology is, I guess, highlighted as a need, the more it will advance.
Yeah.
So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of advancements.
So on the low back pressure materials, even stuff like the way silencers attach to a gun, standardizing on that, it seems like 2024, the suppressor market is just fundamentally better than it was 10 or 15 years ago, in the sense that, take a can from 2010, it would just be worse on every axis than a new can that comes out today, I think, unless I'm wrong. So to the extent that that's true, maybe you disagree that that's true.
I think that's both right and wrong. I think in some ways, if you look back in silencer history, particularly, a decade ago or decade and a half ago, there were what I like to call the Great Sound Wars. And people figured out pretty quick on several different systems how to trap the most combustion gases, do it very efficiently, and make things quiet in a lot of different regimes. Now, not necessarily as quiet as today, but very quiet. And back pressure was of absolutely no concern, to the point you had military contracts being won with rifle silencers that would physically break the firearms. Like, I mean, if you look at the SCAR 17 and the silencer that AAC created for that, it was a complete disaster. I mean, they had to bore holes to the side of the silencer to avoid malfunctions in the firearms. Wow. They were literally venting blast pressure to atmosphere in the chamber itself.
Even with the silencer designed for the SCAR 17.
That's correct, because the folks designing silencers at the time had a very poor grasp on compressible flow.
Wow.
And so in one respect, some of these silencers are extremely quiet. But not very good. So back to your point though. So we go 10, 15, 20 years later, and it just so happens that some of the most popular silencers still have tremendously high back pressure and have really great muzzle suppression. They're trapping gas just as good as they were before, but nothing really new has come. Maybe they're a little lighter, maybe they're cheaper. There's more companies doing them. Mm-hmm. But, the golden age of silencers, I wouldn't really point to those as being part of it. I would point to the ones now that are balanced and highly advanced and taking supersonic suppression to the next levels because of just completely different flow dynamics in the silencers. And it's not only the low back pressure stuff, it's the stuff that's balanced in what we call hybrid designs that's really, I think, forging the way forward. And it's not just rifles, pistols, rifles, subguns, even in rimfire applications, we've seen things. So I think sometimes what's old becomes new again. But I think we've learned so much that there's room to grow still. So you got to be careful because you fall into the nostalgia trap. You look at those cloners, they want to get, I want this rifle from back this war. It was so cool. And they had this, and they get they spend all this money to clone it, and they get the silencer, and it's really not that great, but it looks cool. And I'm with them. I get it, but we can do better.
Yeah. I mean, we want the Mark 23.
Yes.
With the Knight's armament can. We want the early 90s laser aiming module.
I will say the Mark 23 with the Knight's armament can is actually exceptionally good for its size because pistol silencer technology lags rifle silencer technology by a significant amount. We're still in the infancy of pistol silencers.
Why?
Because pistol silencers are harder to make. They have moving parts, and the gas dynamics are more complicated because of how the pistol has to cycle reliably. And what's funny about the Knights can? Every single manufacturer on Earth that makes a pistol silencer, they copy the way Knights decouples the mass of the silencer with the piston. It's a Knights piston. They just copied it.
Oh, Knights invented that.
Well, Knights was the first one to do the axial piston like that. In the Mark 23 trials, HK had, they had some thoughts about how they were going to decouple this gigantic mass hanging off the end of the barrel and let the gun cycle. And, typical German engineering, they had 4 springs on each corner of the dang silencer. And they're like, if we do this, and Knights was like, how about we just have one axially? What do you think? It worked better.
Floppy.
It worked better. And now you see every single one. You pick a pistol silencer for a center fire combat handgun, and you have it's just a Knights piston with looks different. I mean, the Knights pistons are actually better, and they're engineered to be extremely reliable. But the other companies took that design and they made it way easier to manufacture. And this will work. Let's use an O-ring and da-da-da. And almost everyone, I think if you just look in the market, they're all Knights pistons.
Mm-hmm. So what? Well, maybe I should just explain for listeners. So if most pistols, and correct me, Jay, if I get anything wrong, but most pistols have a barrel that tilts when the gun opens to cycle the gun, and a big silencer, which might weigh, half a pound plus, hanging off of the end of that barrel, interferes with that barrel's movement in the gun cycling, which prevents the gun from cycling. And so the way most pistol silencers work is they have a spring that basically isolates the silencer's movement for a second from the barrel's movement. So the barrel can move, and it takes the silencer a second to move in in turn because it's separated by that spring. And in the meantime, the gun is cycled, and the gun's action is none the wiser.
Yeah, that's technically correct. And there are two forces that allow that to happen. The first is the inertial force of the silencer. It's Newton's second law. The silencer will just sit there in space, and if you move something, it has a force to resist motion. It's just its inertia. It'll sit there. The second force that helps is it's actually the thrust vector from the muzzle jet, and it impinges upon the blast baffle of the silencer, the first reflector in the silencer, and that's going to push against that, and it will compress the spring. So it's and the reason why it's in a colloquialism called a booster is because when they were designing that system, it's thought to be a recoil booster because it's boosted by that muzzle jet. I've always called it an inertial decoupler because I think it's like a more technically correct term, but and there are a couple of folks that have coined the different terms over the years, but in popular terms, it's a booster. It's a recoil booster. That's what people call it. It's an inertial decoupler in some other ways. But yeah, essentially a modified Browning tilting barrel action on a pistol, like a Glock, a SIG, or any of these. For a moment in time, when you fire that gun, you want everything locked up. If it unlocks too early, you have overpressure that can leak out of the breech that can be hazardous. So you want to keep that locked, not forever, but long enough so that the blast load will blow down through the muzzle. And so you totally upset the balance of the gun when you hang a silencer off of it, to the point where like the poor handgun engineer sitting in his cubicle is like, oh my God, they wanted a threaded barrel, but what have they done?
So how much of that, like, you mentioned, we got onto this because pistol silencers are harder to design than rifle silencers because of this constraint. How much of that, like if all pistols had a fixed barrel, if every pistol was, blowback or gas operated or something and the barrel didn't move, would pistol silencers still be harder to design for some reason or not?
Man, this is like, it's almost like if you didn't know any better, you'd say that you planned the question because, but I know you didn't, but like it's wild that you're asking that because I literally just bought one of those new Walther PPKs that they just released, that Walther PPK SD, right? Like a lot of people have had Walther PPKs and threaded them in the past, but you had to go to a gunsmith due to the way the barrel is. You had to have it turned down and then threaded for an adapter so it looked right. It was a whole thing, right? And you could buy the rimfire ones. Anyway, Walther just released the SDs for the PPK in the actual, like in the 32 ACP, like Bond used, and also like 380 if you're into that. But the 32 ACP is like the original Bond cartridge, right? So anyway, the Walther PPK is a blowback pistol. Okay, it is not a tilting barrel pistol. The barrel is actually fixed, so its method of operation is pure blowback. In that the energy translates directly to the slide moving rearward, and is resisted by the slide's mass, or its inertial resistance, and compressing the recoil spring. There's no tilt lockup. So what you see is what you get. You're basically your slide is going for a ride as soon as you build pressure in the chamber. So suppressing that pistol on a surface, you might think, oh my goodness, now we can just we don't have to use an inertial decoupler or a booster anymore. We don't need any moving parts in our silencers. This is going to be way easier to design. Now here's the rub. It goes back to the first question you asked about low back pressure. What's going to happen on a blowback pistol when the only resisting force is inertia from the slide and spring force from the recoil spring, and you've just restricted the flow out of the end? Well, it's going to be ejection port blast out of the port. You're going to have a problem. It's going to be loud. So you have to now what you should have done for the other pistol silencers, becomes even more important on this type of pistol. Now you're like, oh my gosh, I need to vent my blast load, but you don't want to vent it too fast because you don't want it to be loud at the muzzle. So enter the concept of early time venting. You have to vent in the blast chamber, and there are only a few silencers so far that we've analyzed at the lab that are being able to do this good enough to really be fun to use, and we're still seeking out those types of silencers. I mean, it takes a real big advancement with the combustion energy of a centerfire cartridge to be able to do that right on a blowback handgun.
When you say vent at the blast chamber, where is it venting to? Like
right
to outside the can or to the
No.
or?
That's $1 million question. Where do you need to vent to? Well, a lot of times these advanced silencers, they'll have like annular space. So think of a tube within a tube.
Okay.
Like so an annulus is like a void between two nested cylinders. It's like a fancy word for the void between, like if you had like a, you know, like a roll of pennies inside a roll of quarters and you just had the paper. It's the space between the two paper tubes. So when we talk about venting, what we're really, like the really technical thing we're actually asking to do is we're wanting to clear blast load off the first reflector. We want the blast momentum that builds up in that chamber to not accumulate. We want it to clear, because anything that doesn't clear, it's going to reflect and it's going to go back into the barrel. And like I try to tell folks, this isn't like water flowing through a garden hose. You know, that's incompressible. This is compressible flow. So you're physically sending shock loads through high temperature gas and building blast load at the in the blast chamber. And as soon as you can clear it out and make it go somewhere else, you can get on with business of doing the suppression. But if you have a conventional silencer, you're going to build up so much blast impulse in that blast chamber that the weapon is just going to increase its cyclic rate, but it's going to spit particulates back out of the ejection port, and the chamber pressure is going to be so high at unlock. There's a blast load that's going to come out of the ejection port. It's going to hit your ears, and it's going to seem like it's super loud because it is to you. And the silencer's not able to do as much work. So yeah, that's like a crash course on how that works.
And so the reason that is not as big a problem with rifles is because rifles are gas operated typically, and so it's not just the spring force and the mass of the bolt that's holding the chamber closed. It's
right,
like an actual lock.
Well, that's correct in some ways, in that, like for example, like an AR-15, in the Stoner system, you have a locked bolt in the barrel extension, right? And then you have a cam path, and you have in the direct impingement system, you're sending gas impulse through the gas tube to the carrier key, and as your carrier starts to translate rearward, that cam travels in the path, rotating that bolt, allowing the teeth to unlock. And it's engineered such that it stays locked for long enough that the pressure in the chamber can drop down below a safe level before extraction. Now, add a silencer, and you can run into the same problem on an AR that you do on a pistol. It just so happens there's so many different knobs to turn on the rifle. I mean, with an adjustable gas block or a heavier buffer, or a fancy whatever, you can control your gas system. You can control the unlock. A pistol, it doesn't have a system like that. It doesn't have as many knobs to turn. You're limited to, doing special, I don't know, like, with a blowback pistol, for example, like a 22, I've had custom masses machined that clamp onto a Ruger Mark III bolt. And if you have a high back pressure 22 silencer, it'll make the thing really quiet. It might not even run with regular ammo, but I know that my inertial resistance is one of my knobs to turn, so I can add a knob.
Interesting.
But it's more complicated.
Yeah, that's super cool though.
Yeah, system. Okay. They're all systems, right? So
yeah. So we started out talking about just like the evolution of silencers. They've just gotten a lot better. That is partially true. I guess the question is why, right? Like, was there 10 years ago some like fundamental material science breakthrough? Is it like computer modeling got a lot better? Or is it just like, could somebody have made silencers really great in 1970 and they just didn't think to? Like, what happened?
Well, that's a great question, because we do have technological advancements like in engineering in general. So, that happens. And so as computing power increases and modeling capability increases, we can use technology to our advantage. But I would say that there are really great silencers that were made in the early 1900s. The original Maxim designs are actually fantastic in the basic principles in which they work. I would say, to directly answer your question about what is changing, like, for example, let's pick flow through as a technology. Why are we seeing flow through now? Well, there has been traditionally a trickle down effect in silencer technology from military to civilian market. Historically, I'd say in general. So there. Sometimes, like, let's say you have military requirements for suppression, sound might be one requirement. But, flash is a requirement too. Cyclic rate on the weapon or weapon reliability might be a requirement. And most of all, recently, toxic gases out of the ejection port might be a requirement too. Some military organizations, or should I say, how to say this? Some folks in their jobs in the military shoot suppressed rifles more than others, to the point where they shoot them so much that they might be subjected to harmful debris and gaseous toxins relatively frequently. It's actually funny. Some folks in the military train so much with their rifles in some of the special operations community that they might not even have the silencers on when they're training, not because of the gas blowback, but because they didn't want to break the silencer because they're training so much and the silencers weren't durable enough. I mean, wow. I'm saying, like, it's funny to hear the different accounts from, the different individuals who do that stuff. And I think that, regardless of how wide the need to have gas mitigation proliferates through the larger, like, big army or something, Marines or Army, where they're having a lot of fielded silencers, regardless of all that, I think when the need comes up and someone has a requirement to make that happen and it starts to work its way into solicitations for contracts, you've lit a match. I mean, the race is on. Once there's a requirement for a low flash or low back pressure or low sound, the private sector is going to spring into action with innovation, and that's what the government counts on. Mm-hmm. The government counts on innovation coming from the private sector. They fund this, and then eventually with silencers or any other firearm, frankly, in the firearm community, once they figure out something that works, it's going to trickle down to civilians because, we have the Second Amendment. So we're like, well, yeah, we should be able to own that too. And that's what's been happening. But the funny thing is now, in the civilian market for silencers, I feel like the tail's wagging the dog in some ways. And the civilian companies are sometimes, I think, given the big government contractors a run for their money. And that's really, from our view at Pew Science, I think the past couple of years have really shown some of that, like where you look at some of these big, the guys that are winning these contracts, and then you look at some of these other, these smaller companies, and they are just really competing strongly. In some cases, completely beating the performance of some of the long-term military contractors, which I found to be fascinating. It's very
it makes sense.
Inspiring.
Like 20 years ago, yes, there was a civilian silencer market in the sense that civilians could buy silencers, but that really wasn't, what percentage of the revenue was that driving the requirements? It was really just like table scraps from whatever the military was doing. Now, like you said, it's kind of the opposite. I would actually be surprised if revenue, like silencer company revenues from militaries, are higher than civilians. I'd expect the civilian market to be bigger at this point.
I agree. I think the civilian market's huge. One Here's a funny, like, not a litmus test, but one, obviously there's like all kinds of indicators you could look at probably, right? But one indicator is that Knight's Armament is selling to civilians a little bit more. So you're like, that's funny. That's interesting. I think that's interesting. I think one thing that has, well, to your point about them not being as common several years ago, I think one thing that has spurred the growth of the consumer silencer market is vendors that you leverage technology to make the approval process easier. And especially now with more electronic automation from the ATF, approval times are so quick. You can get a silencer so quickly. Before, I mean, we would, for example, 20 years ago, I say, oh man, I want to go buy a silencer. I want to buy a sawed-off shotgun or any other Title II, regulated firearm. And I'd find some esoteric, dealer on his kitchen counter. We'd set up a meeting and like, okay, I have this silencer. I have this silencer. I get it. We fill out the paperwork. I'd send it off. And in a few months, I'd get my tax stamp back. And then you get the silencer from the guy. That went on for such a long time that eventually we had wait times that were like a year and a half, and it was getting ridiculous. But now, as the demand spiked so great, I think, and the technology caught up, now we're back to we went back to the 3-month wait with the assistance of the technology, and now it's advanced so much. Now I've seen people get their silencers, their tax stamps back in like 48 hours or less, and I'm like, wow, you guys don't understand how amazing that is.
Yeah.
So it's not getting the silencer market's not getting smaller.
Yeah.
It's not, the demand's not going down.
Yeah.
The companies aren't reducing in number. I mean, it's not getting smaller. It's not like the amount of civilian legal silencers in the United States is decreasing by any stretch of the imagination. It's like, it's still expanding.
There's like a self-reinforcing effect there where, the easier it gets, the more people learn, the more invested they get. And now companies have an incentive of like, oh, we have more customers. We have to make them happy. The competition's higher. I remember years ago, like probably 15 years ago, I went into a gun shop. This was like before I knew anything about like NFA space or Title II stuff. And they said, oh yeah, you can get a machine gun, but the ATF can come into your house and search your house anytime they want to.
Oh,
and all this like, all this FUD I did an E-Form 1 recently for an SBR, and I got the approval back on the E-Form 1 before the stock that I ordered arrived.
That's amazing.
It was like magical. So, and I think it's like you said, it's only getting better, right? Like,
yeah. I mean, it's so great. I mean, I say it's so great, but at the same time, it's all like we're literally talking about extortion, where we're like, well, we have to pay the government $200.
They're extorting us more efficiently.
It's like, yes, please let me pay my taxes more. No, it sucks, but hey,
it builds pressure. I think it builds pressure to. I think that like helps create a world where there's a much stronger push to get rid of these rules altogether.
I really, I think about that a lot, especially just because, just what I do. I don't think there's a day of my life now that goes by without intense discussion or thought about silencers. So it's kind of just what I live and breathe now, which is, I guess, a blessing and a curse. And so I think about this and I think about the numbers, and I think they're still dwarfed by the number of gun owners. I think there's way more traditional firearms, quote unquote, in the United States than there are silencers, obviously. But the fact that the volume moving through the distributors is what it is, I just can't imagine we have this as being a restricted item for much longer. Like, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, the throughput is so high, and they're taxing it with every item. It's got to be common use eventually.
Yeah.
It just doesn't compute to me. Like now, you look at like a machine gun, like a transferable machine gun, anything manufactured before May 1986. I have a couple of those. You know, there's a finite supply. Are those going to be taken off the registry and made Title One? I think there's less of a chance. But I think if the silencers end up being Title One, boy, would that open some doors for machine guns to be Title One.
Yeah.
So I'm very optimistic, but I'm cautiously optimistic and a realist. So I don't know if it's going to happen.
I like to think about, how the technology would have evolved in the absence of the regulations. So in a world without the NFA, like if the NFA never existed, would all silencers have wipes?
Oh, no.
No.
Actually, wipes are, I don't know how controversial this is to say.
Oh, go for it.
But wipes are very primitive and so niche in their use case that I'm not saying they're worthless, because they're not. I mean, they can create a system that is smaller than typical and highly effective for close quarter operation for a very niche use, but they completely destroy precision, because you're physically impacting a membrane with the projectile. I mean, just to give you an example, folks worry about different cross-jetting from supersonic gases passing the bullet in the silencer and pushing on the turbulence, pushing a little bit for like precision rifle applications. They're worried about that. Imagine now putting the bullet through a physical membrane. Yeah, that's going to push it a little bit more than the gases, guys.
Yeah,
and shoot a group with a wiped silencer and waste a box of ammo if you want. Like, you know what I mean? That's my opinion on that. But I think if this is actually an interesting argument. If you didn't have restriction, would you have more advanced silencers? There's two arguments to that. On one side, you say, well, yeah, because more people will be able to experiment, innovation would run rampant, the American ingenuity would prevail. And then the other argument is, it'd be folks in their garages making stuff because it's easy, and it'd be like Europe. And the silencers aren't advanced in Europe. Because they're not. I mean, there are some advanced systems in Europe, but by and large, the United States is head and shoulders above what's going on in Europe. Even some of the European companies that have now set up manufacturing operations here in the United States, they're behind. They're not even close. So I see that environment in Europe. I'm like, well, if you can buy an unregulated silencer in a gun shop in Europe, why don't we have whiz-bang awesome silencers in Europe? It may be, is it not as many guns there? I don't know.
That's interesting.
You know what I mean? So you see both arguments, right?
What's your best guess for why?
For the European stagnation of technology?
Yeah.
Probably culture. I think
just like not enough kind of passion around
and
it.
And I think I just think that on the consumer side, I think the American gun culture is stronger. I think also our military has more budget than a lot of those other countries in Europe, and I think our military is willing to throw a little bit more money at things. And I think the companies, the defense contractors that make those, are also able to sell to civilians here. And I guess the military industrial complex works for silencers more. I mean, I'm just guessing, right? I don't know.
All right. So wipes, we're anti-wipes. What about integral suppression? If the NFA never existed, would every gun by now be integrally suppressed?
There's a famous I think the most famous integrally suppressed.
There's a word in there somewhere.
Yeah. The most famous example of that technology that I know of is the MP5 SD.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably one of the coolest ones too, because what it did was it took, back then there wasn't a lot of subsonic 9mm. There was just like NATO spec stuff, and it was all supersonic. And so they're like, well, we want to be quiet. We can't suppress the sonic boom from the projectile, so let's bleed down the velocity with porting. in the barrel. So they're bleeding down the velocity with porting in the barrel. They're lowering the velocity and simultaneously venting combustion gases into the silencer. And the barrel's shorter, so they're directly venting into the silencer from the muzzle blast. And so the recipe for quiet is ridiculous, and MP5SD is super quiet. So the problem with integrally suppressed weapons is cleaning them is a nightmare. And you don't have to bleed off velocity like the MP5SD. You wouldn't have to port the barrel. You could use like if you made like a new iteration of an MP5SD with a non-ported barrel using subsonic ammunition, it could still be pretty quiet. Probably just you'd have to engineer it differently, but you'd still have a larger silencer than normal, so it might be heavier. Maybe you offset some of that weight with a shorter barrel. They do integrally suppressed pistols and rifles with rimfire. Sometimes, I think cleaning becomes a nightmare. It just depends. It depends how it's configured. I don't think they would be as popular because I think folks want to be able to take the silencer off the gun a lot too and add it.
Makes sense.
And it increases weight and size.
What about like distribution of that weight? You can imagine for I don't know, like a pencil barrel, like bolt action mountain hunting gun.
Oh,
that sort of thing. Like that seems like a pretty good application.
Well, I think let's. No, that's a good point. And so I would actually say instead of like so. There's a couple definitions of integrally suppressed. Some people just call any silencer with any barrel with a built-in silencer to be integrally suppressed, and that's not the true definition. Is what the MP5SD does. That's like what a purist would say. That's an integrally suppressed gun. What you're talking about, I think more of something like a reflex design, where let's say you have like a pencil barrel hunting rifle you want to go hunt elk with in Colorado or something. Right now, you're hiking with your buddies. You want a light rifle, and and it's already long. You don't want to be too long. What you could do is you could design a silencer that it does screw to the muzzle, but it goes back over behind the muzzle with more expansion volume, engineered in a certain way to cut down on your length while still suppressing well. And that actually, there are some that exist, and I think you're going to see more. So that's one advancement I think would help. That would probably be more popular if silencers
that
were
makes more sense.
regular.
Yeah. The MP5SD, by the way, is responsible for in Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six video game, the belief that silencers take away power from, like, make your gun weaker.
Oh,
because in the game,
I mean, they do with the MP5SD.
Yeah, exactly. And in the game, if you use the SD, the gun's weaker.
Right. I forgot.
I think that just like proliferated to all video games, and then like my whole generation or our whole generation grew up thinking like, oh, silencers take power, it would take like velocity away from the bullets.
You know what's interesting about, well, for one, the MP5SD does do that because of the ported barrel. But I would say in general, technically, silencers will increase velocity by a little bit, because they increase the push distance, so that the momentum of the combustion gases is confined for a little bit longer. And you know what's interesting about that? If you take an unsuppressed gun, well, no, just forget about gun. You take any barrel with a projectile in it that's pushed by some kind of expanding gas. It doesn't have to be a gun. It can be something else. And as soon as that projectile leaves the end of the barrel, for like a few diameters of distance past that muzzle, there's enough that there's push distance that's still there's gases that are still transferring momentum to that bullet. So you have an extra push distance past the muzzle of a couple diameters, between a couple and a few diameters. And when you add a silencer, that little distance of 2 to 3 diameters increases a little bit. And so you might get like, I don't know, 10, 20 feet per second more from a suppressed rifle versus it depends on the silencer.
It's, I guess, like, not over the whole length of the silencer, because
no,
it's not.
Well, it better not be, because if that happened over the whole length of the silencer, your silencer would be really bad because it wouldn't let any gas expand.
Right.
It would just be a barrel extension.
Yeah.
And if it's a barrel extension, for sure it's going to increase your velocity, right? Because it's only allowing one-dimensional expansion.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
So like a couple other trends, not that wipes or integral suppression are really trends, but so user serviceability is another big one. I'm basically, this podcast is me just asking you all my
no. This is great. This is
I've ever wanted to know about silencers.
This is cool.
What's the point? Like, do we need user serviceable cans for center fire? Like, is that to like? It seems like one more thing that's gonna unthread itself. One more thing to go wrong. Like, am I wrong about this?
It's funny how controversial this can become, this question. I've seen the most heated debates on the internet. Well, the internet's always civil, right? There's never any. No one ever calls anyone names on the internet. No. So the answer is yes. You do want to be able to clean a centerfire rifle silencer. That is like the short answer. The longer answer is that it really depends on your firing schedule, the type of weapon, the type of ammunition, and the type of silencer. Some silencers, due to the way they work, can take thousands upon thousands upon thousands of rounds, and the performance drop from the buildup will just not be that bad, or even noticeable. And some of them, for a while, they start to sound a little better as turbulence builds from the roughness inside, and little pockets are changed and flow changes. So like with the centerfire rifle, this really high pressure, it's uncommon to have to clean them very often. However, as you increase in performance potential, once you start to get silencers that have more complex flow pads that are doing things with supersonic ammunition that's just incredible, it's like a Ferrari. It's like, yes, you can buy that Ferrari, and yes, it is fast and it is awesome, but you cannot treat it like it's a Honda Civic. It's not. You need to maintain it. You cannot. It's a Formula One car, and you just rode it like a Formula One car. So don't think it's like, oh yeah, I can change my oil every 10,000 miles. It'll be fine. It's like, no, you probably need more regular maintenance intervals because it's doing something more complicated. And it's maybe that's a bad example because it's not like we're wearing parts more because it's a more complicated engine or something. But there are the performance becomes more, or the drop in performance becomes more noticeable just because they're so dang quiet. Like there's rifle silencers now, like in 2024, you can put on a 308 bolt gun, and they're so quiet that, I mean, yeah, you're going to hear the supersonic crack, but the muzzle blast is effectively taken down to levels like below a 22, and you're like, how is this even happening? It's insane. And so with those silencers, if you want to maintain the pinnacle of suppression performance, the manufacturer will recommend, well, weigh the silencer when you get it, shoot it, and when it gets about an ounce heavier than it was when you bought it, clean it with our special whiz-bang cleaner.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be take apart. There's chemical compounds that, I mean, from several companies that do wonders.
Yeah, you can just soak it in the.
You can soak it. You put it in like a little, like a jar, and soak it and agitate. Depending on the material, you can use an ultrasonic cleaner to help that along. Simple Green too can help. It just depends. I don't want to start throwing out chemical names because it just depends, but they're out there.
Okay. So you're not a real gun guy if you don't have a spreadsheet with all your silencers with weight in grams.
That'd be crazy. I'm sure I would do that. Like if I wasn't running Pew Science, and all of our spreadsheets are like ATF bound book stuff, because it's like,
okay,
just tracking inventory now, but
silencer weight tracker. Yeah. What about modular cans?
Oh man,
I feel like a bunch launched a few years ago. I haven't seen them as much, like new ones recently.
Good question.
Is that just one more thing to go wrong?
Can be. I think sometimes. So when you say modular, just for folks listening, you're talking about like a silencer that can be long or short depending on needs.
Yes.
I think it can be a waste of time, and it can also be quite high utility. And really, I think this is for the consumer. If you're someone who has access to all these silencers, you wouldn't care. You just get a couple different ones. But for the consumer who only wants to pay one tax stamp, for example, I mean, a $200 fee can sometimes, be a lot for people. And so, but at least all at once. And so if they're able to, for example, let's pick a rifle silencer. What's a famous modular rifle? Like a Rugged Surge is like a famous centerfire rifle silencer that's modular. I'm trying to think of other modular rifle silencers, but Rugged Surge is like probably one of the most famous centerfire rifle.
A hybrid Silencer Co. made a hybrid. I think that's modular.
I don't think was it modular. I think the Hybrid 46 is an overboard can that can be used on a lot of different things, but I don't know if it's modular.
I think I'm misremembering that.
I'm just going off of memory too, but I don't think the hybrid's modular. I could be wrong. I mean, it has different mount capability, but I don't think it's modular in length. Am I wrong about that? I have to Google it.
Oh, okay. Here we go. So they made a hybrid, and then they made a Hybrid 46M.
Oh,
that has a front little extension.
So you're right. That is modular. Okay. So here's a good example. So let me think, because we've tested the Rugged Surge and it's on the website. So Rugged Surge, I think it's in its long configuration. If I remember correctly, it's around 9 inches long. So it's a long guy, It's pretty good on a bolt gun, but dang, it's long. And so you make it short configuration, which isn't super short, but what is it, like 1.5 inches, 2 inches shorter or whatever. And it still is not bad. But of course it's going to get louder. So you got to ask yourself, well, what's my need? How often am I shooting? If it's louder, like as long as I don't shoot it that much, maybe it'll be okay. It's just like a toss up, right? For me, when I think about modular, I think for a new silencer owner, I think modular silencers are more attractive. I think as you continue to buy silencers or you shoot more and you start to marry certain silencers to certain guns and you figure out that's the most efficient thing to do and you start just leaving the silencer on the gun, you start to shy away from modular stuff because your silencers become purpose use. But for the person that has a bunch of different guns and they're not going to shoot that much and they want to be able to use one silencer for like 3 different guns, I think modulars can be okay. You just got to know what you're getting. Now, some of these new modular silencers, we just tested that Cat SC. Did you see that pistol silencer?
No.
I think we published it a couple weeks ago. Oh my goodness. It's nuts, man. And it's modular. And when you make it shorter, it's louder, but it's like not nearly as loud as you think it would be. And so when you get to advanced technology like that, you're like, whoa, maybe modular is cool. Because now I have something like, it's as long as the famous other case silencers are for 9mm, but then if I put the extension on, it's like quieter than anything. And you're like, ooh. And now if I have different pistols, maybe I can, mess with that. So I don't know. For me, it's all about technology, I think.
Yeah. I think part of the reason I'm asking about this is I live in fear of silencers unthreading themselves, like threading themselves off the barrel or all the parts of a silencer that thread together, like end cap, mount, and a modular thing in the middle. Like, I am curious. I'm not aware of this. Maybe you are, of a silencer that can be assembled or disassembled without relying on torque. Like by hand, you mean? Yeah. So like some sort of locking mechanism or is there such a thing?
There absolutely
is in the past.
Well, there absolutely is, and it's probably more simple than you're thinking. It's called a taper interface. So, Like take a here. Okay, let me give you a very famous example of a modular system that is meant to be taken apart by hand completely. The AAC Tyrant 9 modular version, not the original Tyrant 9, but the Tyrant 9M.
Mm.
So there's a dude. His name is Mike Smith, right? He used to work at AAC like a long time ago. I think he works at Dead Air now. He worked at AAC, and he one of the coolest things about Mike's brain is that whenever he would design a silencer, he would want to be able to disassemble it by hand and put it together by hand. You wouldn't have to use tools.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was so cool. And that silencer would not come apart shooting it. And even that Cat SC we just tested, it's not going to come apart. That rugged surge, it's not going to come apart. There's a little taper interface on the edge. So when you screw in that modular section by hand to the end, it's the friction force is amplified by the angle, and it won't unthread. You can do it by hand. Now, that's that part, but the end cap you're talking about, that one, depending on the silencer, you might need a little tool to snug it, and it won't come off if you use the tool. It'll be all right.
Can you explain about the taper? How I don't understand the physics of that.
Yeah,
how
that's
does
okay.
that work?
Yeah, so when you have two threaded parts, and like let's say let's use an example of a rifle barrel with a silencer that has like a 90-degree shoulder. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the end of the rifle barrel is threaded. You cut the threads, and you have a 90-degree shoulder, and then you put the silencer on it, and you twist it on until it bottoms out, and then you snug it with your hand, and you're wanting to tighten it, right? So what you're physically doing, you're trying to do, you're actually the angle of the threads. It's like an inclined plane, right? And you're twisting around it, and so that's pushing onto the shoulder, and it's creating what we call a normal force. Okay. Now, there's in order to loosen it, it's created a force, and you're also stretching the threads a little bit, but barely, right? So you're forcing against the shoulder, and in order to loosen it, what do you have to do? Well, you forced it against the shoulder so hard that there's a static friction force keeping it from rotating. Mm-hmm. It's the coefficient of friction times the normal force. That's the friction force you have to overcome to loosen it, right? Mm-hmm. So if you can tighten it enough with a 90-degree shoulder by hand, it's not going anywhere. It's going to be fine. But thing about people's hands is they're weaker than tools because you can't generate you can't generate a torque because you don't have a wrench. Mm-hmm. So your hands are slippery. You're like, shoot, you can't do it. So if you seat on a 90, what if you sat on a taper and you had a taper interface?
Okay.
Now you're screwing on, and you can actually, with every rotation that you take, you can significantly amplify the normal force that's normal to that surface because you're at an angle now. And if you ramp up that force that's that's normal to the surface, mm-hmm. you're increasing your friction force. And if you increase your friction force, that's the force that's retaining it, so it won't come off. That's why, if you ever go to a machine shop and you go look at how they hold different fixtures and stuff, like the tooling, there's tapered interfaces so they don't come apart. It's just a different type of geometric fastening mechanism. It's a torque amplifier. It's a friction amplifier.
Okay. How come you can loosen it with your hand, though?
Oh, well, you can, but it's a little harder.
Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah. Thanks for that. So we're talking about attachment mechanisms and that sort of thing. This was something that used to bug me 10 years ago of like, oh, every manufacturer has their own standard and I have to put the same flash hider on all my guns. And then I changed from the ASR to the chemo one. And I was like, oh, now I have to get all new flash hiders. This problem seems to have just gone away in the past 5 years. So most companies have standardized on this hub standard where, the back of most companies' silencers now has standard diameter, standard thread pitch, and they don't all use the same muzzle device, but they all have that same kind of back end of the silencer. So if you have a dead air, you can put in a module into those threads that lets you see it on dead air muzzle devices, or same with silencer cone, same with all the others, or most of the others. So is that the end of history? Have we just found the standard for attachment, or do you see that continuing to evolve?
I will say it's certainly convenient, isn't it? Going back to what we were talking about earlier with the contractors winning like military stuff, like Knight's Armament, Surefire. You'll notice that a lot of times they don't have that universal back end on their sound. Well, they don't have that universal back end. And anytime you give flexibility to a system, when you engineer it, you introduce a failure point. You also introduce a compromise in which you have now removed a constraint from the system. You are now allowing someone to physically change your system. And what are we specifically allowing to change? We are allowing someone to change the way we put the blast load into the silencer. We're like, oh yeah, here's a silencer that I worked really hard on. It's awesome. It does XYZ. By the way, I know how we tested it, but I'm going to let this user who I don't know put anything they want that'll thread into this. Go nuts, have fun, be safe. And you're like, and you want to think and I'm speaking as a for instance, like if I was a manufacturer, I would want to think, well, I'm going to do the best to educate the buyer. I'm going to do the best to educate my customer to help them with the best choice of potential mounting solution for their application for this silencer, because A, I want my customer to have a good experience. B, I don't want to be fixing the silencer when they break it. Right. It's too so even if they're not benevolent and they don't care about the customer, which they should, but even if they don't care, they should be caring about their warranty work. Yeah. Because I can tell you right now, if you let a consumer do something outside the operational boundaries of what you intend your product to do, there will be a non-zero increase in warranty claims. I'm not saying it's going to be a huge increase. I'm saying it's a non-zero increase. Mm-hmm. So with that caveat, I would say that it's a good thing, and I think it's going to continue because consumers demand it. But when you look at Surefire and Knights and some other silencer companies that continue to try to fight this, like Rugged tried to fight it for years. They tried to fight it. They didn't want hub. They have a hub now. But for years they were like, no, we're not doing that. and you can't blame them really when you really think about it, But you look at Knights and Surefire, they have an index pin in the silencer or on the mount key. And it let's say you install your silencer, you take off the silencer, you install the silencer, take off the silencer. You want that silencer to be clocked the same way every time, because if it's not, your point of impact shift can change and your zero can change. Mm-hmm. So if you are going for a military contract with your silencer and one of the requirements in the solicitation says, well, you better have precision of XYZ after detaching this many cycles. I'm just, for instance, right? Let's say they did something like that. Well, what silencer are you going to be more sure of for performance and that's dummy proof?
Yeah.
Well, if you had a mount that's freaking basically torqued to death or glued to the end of your rifle and you can't move that mount no matter what, and when you put the silencer on, 100% of the time that silencer is going to be clocked in the exact same spot because there's an index pin. Why on earth would you put a hub capable threading the back of your can. It'd be so dumb because you're like, oh, well, we engineered this system so well, but now we want to give the user the opportunity to mess it up. And so you see from their perspective, it's way simpler. But the consumer, they're not in the military shooting silencers. They want to go to the range with their buddy, and they don't want to invest. Like if the new mount, they're like, oh, well, this mount sucks. I want to change my mount. And they don't want to have to buy a new silencer. Well, yeah, they're going to want a universal back end because it's cheaper for them and it's more economical, or more convenient. And I agree with that. So you have is the tail going to wag the dog? Is it going to be consumer pushing military to say, I think everything needs to be hub? Probably not. The military is going to be like, we don't need that. Stop.
Yeah.
With the armors, don't need more work. We're fine. But the consumer silencer companies that are pushing technology forward, maybe they make hub so popular that now it's everywhere because they're consumer driven.
That seems like the way it's going, right?
It is going. It is. We're there. We can't put it back in the box. It's like hub mounting is never going away. There are too many companies. There's a secondary and tertiary revenue market for mounts. There's companies. All they do is make silencer mounts compatible with hub systems. They don't make silencers. They don't make guns. They don't make anything other than mounts, and they're making millions and millions of dollars.
Wow.
So why? So they're gonna love this too. They're gonna keep doing it.
Well, so your job is, you test silencers for a living. Is there, if we look at Pew Science in a year or 2 years, are we going to see you testing? Okay, I tested this 5 different mounts on this silencer. Like, is there? Do they make a difference at that level?
It's funny. We have done that.
Okay.
Here and there.
You go.
Here and there. Just because for one, our own intellectual curiosity. 2, because some mounts tank performance, like in a terrible way. Some mounts doesn't matter. And you know what's really hard thing is that it depends on the silencer and the mount. And so it's like a really non-linear effort curve where you're like, oh my God, like what am I going to do? There's so many permutations. But to answer your question specifically, due to the state of the practice, I think probably will ramp up mount variation testing more because it's becoming more of frankly, I think it's becoming more of an issue because of the flexibility they've given consumers. I don't think, and I'm not blaming consumers for this. If I had to blame anybody, I'd blame the weapon manufacturers and the silencer manufacturers because, to my knowledge, neither one of them has taken responsibility for what goes wrong when they use an incorrect mount. And you can't blame either one of them. You got to blame both because it's the fault of both. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you see with that is companies making both the silencer and the gun because they're like, well, we're done with this game. And so you see SIG. Look at SIG. They're making the gun and the silencer. They're like, we're done. They're like, we're just going to make them both. We're going to win the contract. We have both.
Yeah.
Knights does it too. But, consumer companies, slowly.
Yeah.
I think it's going to happen. I think there's going to be consumer companies that start making the guns and the silencers.
Huh. So, well, I mean, Silencer Co. made the Maxim 9. It's kind of a one-off. But
they should bring that back. I think that was a cool gun.
That was super cool gun.
It was super cool.
I don't know why
right?
it didn't do better, but
I don't know. You know what? I bet it didn't do better because the wait times are so long. I bet they introduce it now. I bet it'd be way more popular.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah. I think just literally a few months of wait time can be the difference between of like NFA, waiting for the
opportunity cost, right? How are you going to tell a consumer that they're going to let's say, yep, you got to spend $950 on this silencer, and guess what? You also got to write a $200 check to a government agency. I know that was a lot of money. I know you saved for a while, and guess what? You're not going to get it for a year. Like most normal people are like, this does not sound like a good deal at all.
Yeah.
Like this sounds completely and utterly insane. Why would I do that? And I think about that. I'm like, that's probably why the silencer market isn't bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Okay.
always been the weight. It's not the tax stamp. It's the weight.
Yeah, I remember my worst weight ever was. Do you remember Silencer Co. ran the buy one get one free
Oh,
promo? Like,
I absolutely remember that.
almost tanked the company.
Yeah, it's horrible. Bad idea.
But great deal for consumers.
Yeah.
So I got my I think it was an Octane 45 pistol silencer. Yeah. That was my like get one free.
That's cool.
But it was 2 years from the time of like placing the order for the initial silencer to getting that one, to submitting the request for the second one, to getting the tax stamp for the second one. Today, not that they would run a buy one get one free again, but if they did, you'd have your second silencer in probably in a month or two.
I mean, that would be, yeah, if I was a consumer, I'd be like taking advantage of that.
Yeah.
Like immediately.
So we talked about like attachments, modularity, hub system on the gun end. So the muzzle device end of things. Does flash hider versus muzzle brake matter as far as suppression?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess to answer that, I will have to qualify it, but let's talk about rifle.
Okay.
So, let's talk about AR-15.
Okay.
I'm qualifying it because I want to give an answer, but I don't want someone hears that. Well, but what about no
AR-15 my FN 2000 or something?
Let's say like no, but I mean in general the answer is yes. In general, muzzle device can influence silencer performance because in general, muzzle device changes the blast propagation physics into the silencer. So anytime you're changing the physics, you're changing performance. That's it. Full stop. Now, there's a particular thing that happens with a 3-prong flash hider that's different from like a closed tine flash hider or a brake, in that when you use a 3-prong flash hider on a rifle, particularly a short barrel rifle like a Mark 18, it focuses the muzzle jet, and it actually jet cuts the blast baffle like a torch. And with enough temperature cycling, high pressure and temperature, you will slowly erode in the shape of the open tines into the blast baffle. Now, with really, really well engineered rifle silencers, it takes a lot of rounds to really burn through that blast baffle, and the blast baffle is so thick it's going to take a very long time. Like a very common example of this is like on the Surefire RC2 system that'll happen, but the RC2 is built well enough to where it's going to take a long time. So by the time it really matters, you're going to send your Surefire silencer to the manufacturer to get rebuilt anyway, and then you'll be fine. But I say it because these are items that consumers are buying like a one-time lifetime purchase. They're actually consumables, but a consumer doesn't treat it like that because it's a long opportunity. It's a high opportunity cost. It's a $200 tax stamp. It's a pain in the butt. So consumer doesn't view it as the same as it should be viewed. It should be viewed as a consumable, but not for the consumer, and it's understandable. So when let's say you put a brake on the gun instead because you went, you put an open tine flash hider. You put a closed tine flash hider on there. It's not going to focus the jet as much. But what if you put a brake on there? Same gun. Well, when you put a brake on there, the brake is going to have little surfaces in it in which when the muzzle jet expands, it'll start to impinge on those brake surfaces and reflect, and it'll kind of somewhat diffuse the muzzle jet from impinging on the blast baffle, so it will protect your blast baffle a little bit. But in doing so, the reflections that come off of some of those brake surfaces can find their way back into the barrel bore.
Well,
it depends. It depends on it depends a lot on the brake. It depends a lot on the silencer blast chamber, and it depends a lot on and whether it matters depends a lot on the gun. And so you got to be real careful with some systems. Not all brakes, but some certain types of radial brakes or compensators or diffusers can change weapon operation. Like if you take a SCAR, a 7.62 SCAR, like a SCAR 17, it has a little bit of a different operation than an AR-15, and it just so happens that the SCAR 17 is extremely susceptible to early time blast loads coming back into the barrel and doing some stuff that may influence operation. And we've actually done some testing, funny enough, where we took one type of silencer, we put it on the SCAR, we noticed one type of operation. We took that same type of silencer with a different mount and ran the gun with the same gas setting, and the gun violently overfunctioned. So it wasn't the silencer's back pressure that was doing it. It was the early time blast load reflection off of the extra reflector we had added to the muzzle device that did it. And it was to the SCAR specifically. And that and that's actually a good, tying that back to what you asked about universal mounting and and what I said about like who is responsible for this. Is it the manufacturer of the gun or is it the manufacturer of the silencer? Well, using the SCAR as an example, what does FN say? They say, well, if you put a silencer on our SCAR, you have voided your warranty. And people got really mad at FN for saying that. But what people didn't realize is that when an FN SCAR has too much early time blast load reflection coming down the barrel, as the bolt carrier reciprocates, the bolt will accelerate faster than how fast the carrier is moving. And before the carrier even reaches the end of travel, the bolt will slam into the back of the carrier, and the cam pin will hit the path and crack the carrier. Before the carrier has even reciprocated. And what does that tell you? That means you can adjust your gas system all day, every day to try to tune that gun for that silencer, and you're still going to break it if your early time blast load reflection is too high. So what does FN see? They say, well, we're pretty sure our consumers are not blast physicists, so we're pretty sure we're going to void the warranty, and that's going to stop our warranty claims because people are putting silencers on this gun and it's breaking the gun. Now, what could FN have done? FN could have just designed their own silencer and say, you only can use our silencer. But they didn't do that. So the easier way out for FN is to say, well, don't break our gun. Stop breaking our gun. Now, if you want to go super Wild West, like space cowboy time, you can just, you call Pew Science or someone else and you say, well, what silencer do you think I can use on my SCAR and not break it? And I'll tell you, because I use a SCAR with a silencer all the time, but I know enough to not break my SCAR. You see what I mean? And so you're taking a risk, but and so you think about a brake versus a flash hider. In some silencers, I swear you're not going to be able to tell the difference in sound at all. In some cases, you'll break the gun. Mm-hmm. So that's the two extremes, right? It doesn't matter at all, or it matters for everything. It's either all or none in some ways. So it depends.
What is it about the SCAR's design that makes it so sensitive to this?
Oh, it's because the SCAR is another example of a Formula One race car. It is super light and super reliable and super awesome. But if I had to change anything about it, I would probably change that. I'll probably change that path geometry so that if the bolt did accelerate faster than the carrier and slam back, there was some extra material to stop crack propagation from the stress concentration in the steel, which I believe is probably the thing that makes it break there. Now, other people are breaking their SCAR in a completely different ways, just like they break ARs because they're overgassed in general. But I'm talking about the specific thing that happens to a SCAR, even if you tune it. It's a specialized gun. It's like the fact that AR-15s don't break is almost like coincidence. It's just because like the AR-15 wasn't designed for a silencer. Yeah. It just so happens like the AR-15 has a robust simplicity to it. Stoner's original system is more forgiving to additive blast impulse because we can turn a lot of knobs, whereas like the Scar is different. And you go back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, when AAC was like, yeah, we can make a Scar silencer. And they put the Scar silencer on there, and it wasn't. Hey, that was an open time flash hider, right? So it wasn't the brake that was making the Scar's malfunction. It was the fact that the first reflector of the Scar silencer, it reflected blast load to such a degree that the impulse ramped up so high that the gun was so overgassed it just couldn't work right. So they physically drilled cross holes in the blast chamber. And they were like, well, we got to remember, you asked, well, where do you vent blast load? Well, you would want to vent it into an annulus, but they couldn't just take their silencers back and retrofit them with a completely new tube and a new design they hadn't thought of. So they're like, well, just drill holes in it. So how quiet do you think this Navy SEAL dude, this Navy SEAL with the weapon, with the Scar, with the AAC silencer, how quiet do you think that was when he's literally venting blast load out of the blast chamber before it even goes through the silencer? I bet you that was super loud.
It's like, is it a silencer or a muzzle brake?
Is this a muzzle brake now? I mean, they were turning their silencers into muzzle brakes.
Yeah.
And that's and I swear I saw someone the other day, like with nostalgia, say, "Oh, I can't wait to get my AAC Scar HD, like whatever." And I was like looking at that, and I didn't comment on it because I knew, I was like, you know what? I'm gonna let that guy have his moment. I get it. Like, he wants that. I don't want to ruin that guy's day.
It's Christmas morning.
It's Christmas. I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
But like, I wanted to be like, oh my God, you're gonna have such a bad time. So there's videos of it. It's nuts.
Can you tell us what silencer to put on our Scars, or is that paywalled?
We don't recommend silencers. Or should I say, we can't recommend any specific silencer just because it's against our policy. Because we're an independent lab and we don't want folks to be like, oh, they're shilling for a certain brand. So we won't. But I would say that if you are looking to suppress a Scar rifle, I would go with a silencer that has at least a high early time flow rate, if not a high holistic flow rate. And so a few manufacturers that are doing things right now that I would feel comfortable putting on the gun, stuff from Huxworks, stuff from Cat, PTR has some stuff that I might be comfortable using. I haven't trialed it, so I'm very hesitant to say that. I can tell you I've trialed Huxworks silencers on the Scar, and they perform phenomenally. There's some Cat silencers that also perform phenomenally.
Cool.
So if you have a Scar, all is not lost.
Good. I'm glad
now you do have to
that.
real quick though. You do have to worry. The shoulder of the Scar is very, very small on the barrel. So be careful. You can get a special ring from Surefire that will help your bearing surface increase.
Okay. I've seen some manufacturers make muzzle devices
that index on the muzzle
for the Scar.
Yeah, those index on the muzzle instead of the shoulder, and that's another option as well. As long as your shoulder is nice and square, and if it's an FN barrel, it should be. They're pretty good quality.
Okay. Well, this is a good time to talk about Pew Science before we end.
Oh, sure.
So, an hour, 20 minutes in, like, what is Pew Science?
Yeah, let me get some more water here. Pew Science, yeah. So, professionally engineered weaponeering. It's a backronym when I founded this. No, I probably about at this point it was at least 15 years ago. I had an idea about how to test silencers in a way that would be useful for folks. And I kind of, I was busy doing engineering and stuff, and I didn't really pursue the idea. And then around 2018 timeframe or so, I had purchased a bunch of silencers because I was getting back into my gun hobby. And I was like, you know what? I haven't bought new silencers in a very long time. I'm going to go and I'm going to buy some silencers. And so I went to Google and YouTube and all that stuff. And I wanted to find, surely since the early 2000s, there's been significant advancements in silencers. So I'm just going to search for the quiet silencers. I'm going to buy them and I'm going to be so happy. And I'm going to go shoot and hunt and it's going to be great.
Yeah.
So I went to YouTube and I got a bunch and I waited a year, to get them. And they did not meet my expectations. Let me just say that. And I wasn't mad. I was just like disappointed, It's like I'm a busy professional. I have a lot of things going on. It wasn't the money. It was more just my opportunity cost.
Yeah, I mean, you spent thousands of bucks. You wait a year.
Yeah, it was one of those things where I'm not mad. I'm just like, I was just like shook my head like this is not correct. This is not what was sold to me. Mm-hmm. And so I, long story short, my girlfriend at the time, she's my wife now. We were sitting around and I drew an idea on a napkin. I said, what if I could do XYZ and every time I tested a silencer and displayed this metric, someone could be guaranteed that the intensity of the blast would be in accordance with this scale, and there would be no question about how loud it is anymore. And she said, "Can you do that?" I was like, "I can absolutely do that." And that's what I began. That's what I set out to do. So for the next year, I took every single silencer that I owned and some that I borrowed, and I have a bunch. And I built a data acquisition system called Pew Soft. And I took all these guns and all these silencers, and every night and weekend that I had, I went and shot these silencers and I recorded the data. And I analyzed the data for about a year, looking at kind of what made it tick, understanding, from basics, from unsuppressed and suppressed 22 to suppressed 300 blackout to 338 Lapua Magnum. Looked at everything, and we developed something called the suppression rating, which is it's a dose limit. It's on a 0 to 100 scale, and it allows you to map the complex interactions of a complicated waveform with the response of the human ear on the same scale for any type of suppressed weapon system input, and the output's just 0 to 100. And so it takes all the guesswork away. And we do all of our testing in the free field, which means, we talked about blast reflections in the blast chamber and breaking your scar and back pressure. That's like wave reflections. We're talking about reflections. We eliminate wave reflections by testing in the free field, as we do in blast engineering, which is my primary field of professional practice. So we're doing that. We're displaying all that data for you on our website, and our laboratory publishes that regularly. And we give an according suppression rating at the muzzle and the ear. So if you look at that, you can say, well, if I'm a guy next to this weapon system when my buddy's shooting, and I want to know how many shots he can shoot while I'm standing there before I need to put ears on, that number is going to tell me on the scale. And if I'm the guy shooting, let's say I'm going to go hunting and I want to shoot a deer, how many shots can I take sighting in my rifle and shooting that deer before I need to wear ears? That's what that scale will tell you. And we've been doing that for 5 years now. We do it. Manufacturers come to us for their own testing, and we're a third-party laboratory, so we'll do validation testing for them. Sometimes we even publish the testing that we do for them on our website, and we give a little disclaimer, say, hey, this is funded by this manufacturer. They came to us for validation testing. Here's a report. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we just take the money from folks, have a membership to our website. We take our internal funding and we do the testing, and we publish that. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're on our 160 something article now. That's crazy.
Awesome. So I think, like, maybe if people don't know how this stuff worked before Pew Science, every manufacturer says, okay, like this can it's 135 decibels with 9mm. This is whatever, 145 with 556, whatever the case may be. What's wrong with that?
That's a good question. So when someone asks you how loud something is, and you say, oh, it's 145 decibels loud, that actually can have a lot of meaning. If you're talking about something like a lawnmower or a jet engine or a chainsaw or maybe a rock concert or something. And the reason why that would have meaning when you're talking about those sounds is because we call those steady state sounds. They're happening constantly. And so when you look at the peak sound pressure level in decibels of those sounds, it gives you a good idea of the loudness. And you can generally say, okay, that's loud or that's quiet. But when you talk about a firearm signature, it's a completely different type of waveform. Instead of a steady state sound, we call it a transient, meaning it's happening very quickly. And with firearms specifically, it's not only happening very quickly, but it's applied very quickly. So when folks looked at unsuppressed gunshots, like, if you just took your hunting rifle or your 9mm carry gun that you carry every day and you don't have a silencer on it and you just shot it in the middle of the field, you'll get a blast wave. You actually get a shock wave from the muzzle blast. And when you look at the peak, you can say, you know what? That's 155 or that's 160 decibels. That's so loud. And you're right. And again, you can talk about that using decibels. But what happens when the shape of the wave changes, and instead of a blast overpressure happening from the muzzle blast out of the end of the barrel, it's contained in a silencer, and now it's in the silencer and it's bleeding out of the silencer more slowly. If you look at the shape in the time domain, like if you plotted the blast pressure over time of an unsuppressed gunshot and a suppressed gunshot, not only is the unsuppressed gunshot much higher amplitude, but the shape of the wave is completely different. It doesn't even look the same. It's like it may as well be a different thing, because it is. So it just so happens that if you try to look at the peak of a suppressed gunshot that might last like 40 milliseconds long, and the peak is happening in 1 microsecond, what on earth would convince you that peak is going to be representative of how loud that thing is? There's multiple peaks. There's millions of peaks. So how do you pick the one that represents what it sounds like? Right? There's going to be frequency, like how sharp or dull is it? What's the tone? There's going to be phase. Is it pushing or pulling in atmosphere? Is it positive or negative? There's going to be timing, like when are the waves coming towards you, and how often are they coming towards you, and for how long are they coming towards you? Frequency, phase, duration, amplitude, all of these things are much more complicated than like 135 dB. So what did we do? Well, we have to run the entire waveform through our analytical code to compute the suppression rating. Because the suppression rating is going to tell you, if I shoot that gun, I pull the trigger, the explosion happens in the gun, it pushes the bullet through. You see in our waveforms, you can see the explosion happening in the silencer, transmitted through the sound speed in the metal to the sensor. Then you see it start to come out of the end. Then it starts to blow down. All of those little things, they're all making your ear do something. It's like if you're jumping on a trampoline with your sibling, and you jump a little bit, and the trampoline's moving a little bit. But what if someone double bounces you? Are you going to fall over? I mean, you could. Well, your ear ligaments are sensitive to dynamic changes in pressure. And those things happening over a long period of time, you cannot characterize them with one point. So we analyzed the whole thing. And that's why the suppression rating works. For example, let's say you took a pistol and a hunting rifle and an AR-15, and you put a silencer on all three of them, and you shot them, and the peak decibel you measured was 142 dB for all three, which could happen. Who in the right mind would say they all sound the same? Nobody.
Yeah.
But if you get a suppression rating of 32 at the shooter's ear for all three of those, you can rest assured that they're all going to be just as potentially damaging to your ear. And that's what we're mapping. We're mapping potential damage, which for all intents and purposes correlates to loudness. Because we don't really care how loud it is as the shooter, as a consumer, as much as we care about how damaging it is to us. Now, there are outliers. Sometimes things that might might be safer for you in the middle of an open field might actually sound a little bit louder depending where you are. And that's when you move into those high flow rate silencers that we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. Stuff like the Huxworks, the OSS and Huxworks silencers. In the open field, their ejection port blast really tanks. It's not that intense because the ejection port blast is low because there's a high flow rate, but that high flow rate is also making the sound become more boomy, which would be a deep tone. That really boomy, deep tone, some people will say, oh, that's really loud. But well, in the free field, it could be kind of loud, but it's not hurting you. It's not hurting the shooter as much. Mm-hmm. Now you go into a house. Well, now you're no longer in the free field. Well, the suppression rating is not applicable. You see, so at the beginning of our research for the past 5 years is focused on free field sound, and we will be also testing indoors to show what the difference could be. And I think that's going to surprise a lot of people.
That is interesting. So it could be the case that a suppressor that gets a very good score in a free field would get a less good score indoors, and
Absolutely.
Then vice versa for a different
Absolutely.
one. So depending on your
Absolutely. 100%. And the rub is the only way to start this on a good playing field that's fair is to start it in the free field, because we can always go more complicated. We can never go back. It's like if you're a recording artist, like if you're a music person, or if you're a photographer. Like if you're a photographer, you would shoot in RAW format with your images, because then you could use all the information to make your beautiful thing in your Photoshop or whatever they do. You know, mm-hmm. I'm not a photographer, but I think they use Photoshop after that. Or if you're like let's say you're, Kanye, and I hear he's a good producer, right? When he records the stuff, it's probably very high fidelity. And if he wants to do something with his music later, he will then manipulate it. But he doesn't want to start with garbage and then manipulate the compressed audio. Like you wouldn't record at like a low bitrate MP3, right? No, you record your raw waveforms for your audio, and then you do things with it. And so that's what we do. We do it. Not only do we actually acquire data faster than anyone does. We acquire it at 1 megasample per second. Like we acquire the sound from a silencer once every microsecond. That's a million times per second. And we do it in the free field. So the only thing that is influencing the reflection is the ground, but we're at the mil standard test location and 1.6 meters above the ground. So the ground reflection is guaranteed to be standardized.
Wow.
So that's the best we could do. Right.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's what we do. It's cool.
It's decent. It's decent. Cool. Well, where can people go to stay up to date on what you're doing and check it out?
I think the best thing would be pewscience.com. That's pewscience.com. There's links to our podcast. We have it's the J Situation podcast. That started before I had Pew Science, and I figured it'd be a cool name. It just stuck. And so that's what it is. We actually give research updates every week on the podcast. It's on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, everything. And there's links on the There's links at pewscience.com/podcast for that. The silencer sound standard is on pewscience.com. There's 7 sections to the standard. It starts off with basic information to let you know what firearm signatures look like, and it walks you through everything until the suppression rating, and then it shows you articles on every single silencer we've tested, so you have the in-depth information. We're on social media, Instagram. You can find the links from our website, the J Situation Instagram, and Pew Science LLC. Most importantly, you can support our research by joining with a membership at pewscience.com. It's about the price of a cup of coffee per month, and it keeps the lights on, helps us keep testing silencers. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, and I can say personally, it's indispensable when you're buying a silencer. So
I appreciate
if you're spending, a couple $1,000 on some silencers, or even just less than that on one, it's a drop in the bucket, and you're gonna end up with something way better.
Well, I will say, and this is actually, to me, the biggest deal. I never use a silencer unless we test it first. I mean, the whole entire point of this, I literally created the company so that I would have better silencers. And the fact that I'm sharing it with everyone is pretty cool. But I mean, we use our own data. So if you're buying a silencer and you can shoot it first, congratulations. That's awesome. Like you probably have a leg up. But if you can't, the next best thing is using our data, I think, and our analysis.
Yeah. Awesome. Jay Idris, Pew Science. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.